Okay, I think we're set. Good evening. My name is Dina Moses, and I'm the president of the Charleston Interreligious Council. And I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us this evening for our fourth annual James Sawyers Jr. Interfaith Speaker Series. This speaker series is dedicated in honor of Dr. James Sawyers, who's a former president of the Charleston Interreligious Council and who unexpectedly passed away in 2017. We devoted this speaker series to Jim because of the time and energy he put towards this annual event. I think it was his favorite of all our events, and his commitment to interfaith and education. He worked hard to progress religious understanding in Charleston, and we miss him. The subject for this year's series is African American Religious Diversity and Dialogue. It's an 8-part series focusing on African American religious life from various religious perspectives. We had our kickoff last week with Dr. Anthony Penn, and he spoke about the broad context of the nature of Black religion. If you missed that lecture, I encourage you to go to our website under events so you can watch the recording. Now our series focuses on Charleston and the Low Country, and we hope that you can join us for our series. Of course, we're continuing tonight, and it continues every month through February. We're especially grateful to Roper St. Francis Mission Department that made this series possible, and to our partners at the International African American Museum. The Charleston Interreligious Council was formerly known as the Christian Jewish Council of Greater Charleston. It's an organization that has been serving the Charleston community since 1979. We strive to build bridges of understanding and respect of all religious beliefs by creating educational and social events in and throughout Charleston, and of course now virtually. We have many events throughout the year, including our Interfaith Thanksgiving service, which is being held this Tuesday evening at 6:30. It will be held on our Facebook page, but also we will post it under the events page on our website. So please join us that evening, but join us for all our events. We have events throughout the year. Learn more about them, join us, give us feedback, volunteer if you wish, but just be with us if you can. And you can learn more about all of our events and gatherings at our website at www.cicouncil.org. That's www.cicouncil.org. Thank you again for joining us here tonight and for supporting our work. Now I'm going to pass you on to Dr. Elijah Siegler, who will be our moderator this evening. Dr. Siegler is the Charleston Interreligious Council's Vice President, and he's also professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the College of Charleston. Elijah.
Hi, thank you, Dina. Can everyone hear me okay? I just want to go through a few technical matters and then talk about our next speaker in this series, and then introduce the woman who will be introducing our main speaker. So this is being recorded, as you probably know, and we do that so we can make the recordings publicly available on Facebook for anyone who wants to watch this again or who misses the talk. You are all encouraged to keep your camera on. Of course, you don't have to, but you're welcome to, so that when Professor Fordham speaks, he can look at faces instead of blank screens. But you are all being muted automatically, just to prevent background noise. After Professor Fordham's talk, which will be about a half an hour or so, I will invite questions in the chat room, and just send your questions in the chat room to me. I just sent you a notice saying ask your question. So as you come up with a question for Professor Fordham, please just send me the questions. And what I'll do is kind of go through them and order them. And then I will invite people, as many people as we have time to. This program will try to end right at 8 o'clock, be mindful of everyone's time. I'll unmute you, I'll invite you to ask your question sort of live and in person, and I'll unmute you, and then Professor Fordham will respond, and then we'll go on to the next question. So we hope to have a lively Q&A. That's a big part of this event. So let me just very briefly share the screen with you so you can see our next event in our exciting series on African American religious diversity and dialogue. Our next event, which is on a Tuesday, also at 7 p.m., they're all at 7 p.m., Tuesday, December 8th, is Dr. LaRonda Manigault-Bryant, who's a native of Moncks Corner, so just up the road from us, but is currently a professor at Williams College, one of the elite liberal arts colleges in Massachusetts. And she'll be talking about African-American conjure faith, something very special to the Low Country with our history of hoodoo and Gullah Geechee culture. And she'll show a 6-minute documentary that she herself filmed and then talk about that. So that should be a great talk. I hope to see many of you there on December 8th. Let me stop sharing the screen. And finally, let me briefly introduce the Reverend Demet Jenkins, who will introduce Professor Fordham. Reverend Jenkins is a member of the board of the CIC, and it's been a great pleasure for me to get to know her over the last few months when she joined our board. She was born in France, but raised right here in Charleston, South Carolina. She has worked as a counselor, as a chaplain, and she currently is the director of education and engagement for faith-based communities at the International African American Museum, which is one of our partner organizations with the CIC and with the Department of Religious Studies at the College of Charleston, putting together this exciting speaker series. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and invite Demet to introduce our main speaker.
Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see this crowd here tonight, and it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Damon Fordham, who I consider a friend of mine personally and a friend of my family. He's such a historian that he often gives us information about my family that we didn't know, and so I'm always excited to be in his presence, and I'm sure you all will enjoy him tonight. So Damon Fordham was born in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and to Anne Montgomery, and was adopted by Pearl and Abraham Fordham of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. He received his master's degree in history from the College of Charleston and the Citadel, and his undergraduate degrees at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. Professor Fordham is currently an adjunct professor of World Civilizations, United States, and African American History at Charleston Southern University and the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. He has taught U.S. history and African American studies at the College of Charleston. He was a weekly columnist for the Charleston Coastal Times from 1994 to 1998, as well as the author of Mr. Potts and Me, Voices of Black South Carolina, Legend and Legacy, True Stories of Black South Carolina, and co-author of Born to Serve, the story of the WBMC in South Carolina in 2006. He has done lots of research and articles and has appeared in books entitled Sweetgrass Baskets in the Gullah Tradition by Joyce Coakley, South of Maine by Beatrice Hill and Brenda Lee, the Greenwood Encyclopedia of African American Folklore for the University of Missouri, and Orangeburg's 1968 and the Malcolm X Encyclopedia for the University of Southern Mississippi. Sorry, I got tongue-tied because he's done so much work. He's also commented on history and storytelling for numerous radio and television programs in the United States, Canada, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Professor Fordham conducts a walking tour called The Lost Stories of Black Charleston and has received a citation from South Carolina House of Representatives for his work in education, historical research, and social justice. Professor Fordham's motto is, educate yourself to lead yourself, for if you wait on others to show you the way, you will wait for a very long time. So it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce to you all Professor Damon Fordham.
Well, that wasn't a Hallmark card of a greeting. Thanks a lot, Reverend Jenkins. And with that said, basically what I'm here to talk about is the role of Christianity among Black Charlestonians, as well as a couple of other faith traditions. Now, in West Africa, the people who are today African-American Charlestonians come primarily from the upper Western region around Sierra Leone and Liberia, among such tribal groups as the Mendes, the Kises, and specifically the Golas. That's Golas, and that's commonly believed to be the origin of the term Gullah, which refers to the Gullah culture of this area that's preserved many African traditions. Now, among the original traditions of many of these people, many people in the West commonly refer to this as voodoo or vodun, but in reality, when you speak of African religious traditions, there is no singular African culture, although we tend to view it that way. You have thousands of different tribal and ethnic groups and thousands of different customs, languages, etc., that you do in Africa, which we have to remember is a continent and not a country, as much as you do with Europe, North America, or South America. So we always have to keep that in mind. But among the ones who were brought here, there were some very interesting religious traditions. For example, you had what was known as the Saut around the upper west coast of Africa, which is where they would go into various trances where they would connect with the spiritual world, and this would lead into various forms of dances and that type of thing, similar to what we would today call a ring shout and such. They had what was known as libation, where they would pour out liquids in honor of the deceased. They would often pass babies over graves to make sure that the baby would not be afraid of the deceased person's spirit, as well as a tradition of putting a lot of gifts and items that the deceased liked upon their burial places. Now, the thing about the Gullah tradition you have to remember is that when a lot of these Africans were brought from roughly about the coast of Georgetown, South Carolina, down to about Brunswick, Georgia, on the Sea Islands thereof, they were so isolated in many cases that they preserved more of these African traditions than just about anybody else in the United States, with the possible exception of New Orleans. And so to this day, you often see people passing babies over graves and putting gifts of the loved one upon graves. And of course, the Saut can be translated into the modern day shout that you see in a lot of African-American churches. And in the rural churches, you still see ring shouts and that type of thing. So a lot of that sort of thing is very well preserved in this area, in spite of the influence of what would happen later, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So when they're brought here, of course, Christianity in Africa is somewhat of a complex subject because, contrary to popular belief, Christianity existed in Africa long before the transcontinental slave trade. The Bible itself, throughout the Old and New Testament, speaks of Ethiopia, and Ethiopians are mentioned fairly common. One example being Queen Candace, mentioned in the book of Acts, 8th chapter, 27th verse, as well as 2 Kings 19, speaking of an Ethiopian pharaoh by the name of Taharka, and so on and so forth. It's just, pretty much throughout the Bible, you could say. But on the West Coast, where many of the enslaved people of more recent times were kidnapped and brought here, it was not that well known. So oftentimes with the direct ancestors of today's African Americans who are here now, they had little exposure to Christianity before they came here. And this is the source of a lot of controversy. Many people are of the opinion that Christianity was the main force in making African Americans docile when they were brought here. They use examples of the fact that the book of Ephesians was often used in instruction to enslaved people, the verse of slaves, obey your masters, and with fear and trembling as you would Christ, and so forth, being one of the main scriptures that were taught to them. And such things as Matthew 5:7, the meek shall inherit the earth, as well as Dr. Benjamin Mays, who would later become the mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King. In his autobiography, Born to Rebel, he speaks of how a lot of times in the churches, the pastors would sway the people's minds away from what they were going through on earth to basically, as he put it in his exact words, sing and shout their troubles away. So among a lot of people nowadays, they tend to have a very negative connotation as Black Christianity as being something that has made people more docile and accepting of the plight of slavery and segregation. However, there is another side to that altogether that is not often dealt with. You see, one of the interesting things about Christianity in Charleston was that actually, in some cases, it served as an educating and a liberating force. As far back as 1743, you had the Reverend Alexander Gadsden, who taught some 40 enslaved people the Gospels. And not only did he teach them the Gospels, he taught them how to read the Gospels. So much so that two of these people, Harry and Andrew, became the first known Black preachers in Charleston around 1743. And that's very significant because the Reverend George Leal, who preached at the First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, is often credited as being the first African-American minister to preach the gospel. And that church was established in the 1780s, along with a Black Charlestonian minister named Reverend Andrew Bryan, who was from the West Ashley area. And that's the oldest known Black church in America. So Charleston had a hand in that too. So along with that, at the same time they were establishing the First African Baptist Church of Savannah, Georgia, there was the foundation of the AME Church in Philadelphia, African Methodist Episcopal, under the Reverend Richard Allen. Bishop Allen led a number of African Americans out of the white congregation of the St. George Methodist Church in Philadelphia because they refused to allow Black people to take communion at the altar as we often do in Methodist churches. So he led the congregation out of there, and that led to the establishment of what would later be known as the Bethel AME Church. Now, this movement spread to Charleston around about 1818 with the Reverend Morris Brown at the Hempstead AME Church, at the Hempstead African Church, which was on Charleston's east side. And under Bishop Morris Brown, one of his parishioners was in the AME Church, we call them class leaders, which is the equivalent of a deacon or a lay preacher, if you will, by the name of Denmark Vesey, a man who purchased his freedom back about 1799 or so, right in Charleston. Denmark Vesey began organizing enslaved people around about 1819 or 1820 or so to break into the city armory, which is where the former federal courthouse is on Meeting and Broad Street, to break into the armory, steal guns, and set fires throughout Charleston. And when the slave masters would come to put out the fire, they would start to shoot them. And afterwards, he would go throughout Charleston to free Black people and lead them to Charleston Harbor, where they would hijack ships to sail them to Haiti, where they would be free. Postscript. Haiti, by this point, had been liberated by rebel leaders such as Toussaint L'Ouverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who had overthrown Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804. And Denmark Vesey kept up with things like this because his former enslaver taught him how to read. That might sound surprising to some people, but a lot of enslaved people in those days, prior to the prohibition of literacy, actually worked as record keepers and accountants. One such case was Samuel Massey, who served in that fashion under Henry Lawrence at Mepkin Plantation in Corsville, South Carolina, right outside of Moncks Corner. But anyway, getting back to Denmark Vesey. So that was the plan, but he warned his followers not to tell what were known as house slaves. These were people who were on a higher echelon than the enslaved person who worked on the fields. They were the cooks and the butlers and maids, and thus they felt a sort of affinity to the enslavers. So one of his men, William Paul, told about the plot to a man named Peter Prelo, who was owned by Captain John Prelu. Captain Prelu had found out and told the militia, which got Vesey and his men arrested and later hanged around July the 2nd, 1822. Now, it's important to understand that Vesey did encourage people toward his revolution through using biblical verses, such as Exodus 21:16, that said, "He that stealeth a man and selleth him shall be put to death," and Revelation 13:10, that said, "He that leadeth a man into captivity shall be led into captivity." And those were major forces that encouraged Christian Blacks to join Vesey's rebellion. Additionally, he had a man named Gullah Jack Pritchard who practiced conjuring, i.e. a sort of indigenous Africanized religion. And this is what led people who were into who still practice that type of faith, to get involved with the plot. But in either case, they were hanged in July and August of 1822. But it goes to show you that far from making people docile, that was a case of the teachings of the church being used as a vehicle for liberation. And there is a direct continuum of this in Charleston too. Because with the Vesey Rebellion, the state of South Carolina made it illegal to teach African Americans to read and write. And around the same time that all this was happening, there was Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne on 125 Tradd Street, who had a school for free and enslaved children. And because of the Vesey Rebellion, the fact that Vesey used the writings of the Bible and history books and so forth to encourage revolution, the state of South Carolina shut down his school. But he fled eventually to Wilberforce, Ohio, where he established Wilberforce University, which was the first Black college in America that was started and run by other African Americans. And one of the graduates from that institution was a man named Bishop Richard Harvey Kane. Bishop Kane came down here after the fall of slavery and the fall of the Confederacy in 1865. And one of the things that he did was he took what was left of the congregation of the Hempstead African Church, and he built a new church over on Calhoun Street. He named it after the Hebrew word for God is with us, and it would be the mother of the new Black churches in Charleston. And that is how Mother Emanuel AME Church came into being. And it is out of that church that Bishop Richard Harvey Kane built a power base. During the days of Reconstruction, when African Americans temporarily had the vote and political power until racist groups like the Red Shirts and all of them regained control of the state after the fall of Reconstruction in 1877, Bishop Kane became a congressman. And he fought for the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which ended segregation, made segregation outlawed, at least for a time, while Reconstruction was still going on. And he made a very eloquent speech in Congress where he said that for years, they denied the African American the right to an education and had the nerve to complain about them being ignorant. And then on the floors of Congress, he said, shame on you for that sort of thing. And in Charleston, he led a demonstration at the city market in, it was July of 1876. They had what was called the Hamburg Massacre, where Benjamin Tillman, who was the founding father of segregation in South Carolina, led a massacre of African-American men in Hamburg, which is now known as North Augusta. Well, Bishop Richard Harvey Kane led a march of 1,000 African-Americans to the city market to protest that. And he got up and told the audience, according to the Charleston News and Courier on July the 18th, 1876, that there were thousands of African-Americans who had been grown up since slavery and vowed never to return to those conditions again, and knew how to use the rifle and the shotgun and the torch, and vowed never again to submit to such atrocities again. So Bishop Kane would die about some 11 years after this in Washington, D.C., after the fall of Reconstruction. But even with the fall of Reconstruction, the Black church continued in the role to help advance the people. The great Frederick Douglass was invited to speak at Mount Zion AME Church on March the 5th, 1888, and he gave a sermon in which he told the congregation that for years he prayed near his chimney for God to set him out of slavery, but God did not answer his prayer until he prayed with his legs. In other words, faith without works is dead. And at Mother Emanuel in 1898, May of 1898, there was a group of Black ministers from around the state who gathered at Mother Emanuel to protest the lynching of a Black man named Frazier Baker, who was the postmaster of Lake City, South Carolina. And these men sent a petition to President William McKinley demanding that lynching be stopped. Well, unfortunately, though, President McKinley ignored the petition. But Mother Emanuel continued to be a gathering spot for civil rights meetings. In about 1931 or so, the first Black congressman since Reconstruction, Oscar DePriest, gave a speech at Mother Emanuel calling on African Americans to vote at a time when it was very difficult for them to do so in the state of South Carolina. In 2024, the Black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey made a speech at Morris Brown AME Church, and the pastor at Morris Brown AME Church for a time was Reverend John Dart, the man who started what would be known as the John Dart Library, as well as the Charleston Industrial School, which would later be known as Burke High School. So we see with all of this that the Black church in Charleston and in South Carolina, even when you throw in what it did during the Civil Rights Movement, was far from a tool that simply kept Blacks in docility. The Black church played a major role in the efforts to liberate the African American community here in Charleston. And I would be remiss if I not mention a couple of other things regarding other faiths. Earlier, I spoke about a lot of the Africanisms that remained in a lot of the traditions of this area. Well, people like Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne initially tried to stamp out these things among African Americans because, you see, in those days, the assimilation was what was taught. And there were some people who felt that this type of thing was undignified and unbecoming and so forth and uncivilized. But on the other hand, you had ministers like Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, who was originally from Newberry, South Carolina, who basically understood that they needed to fuse a little bit of the old and the new if they were going to get the masses of African Americans to join in with the new faith. So he was tolerant of these things. And the same Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, I might add, in 1878, he led a group of African Americans in Charleston aboard a ship called the Azor to go to Liberia to escape the segregation conditions of that time. And this is long before Marcus Garvey became famous in doing that. And finally, as far as other religions go, you also had Mr. Lewis G. Gregory. Mr. Gregory, who was born in Charleston about 1874 or so, graduated from the Avery Institute and was involved with the early years of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, became a civil rights lawyer. But then in Washington, D.C., he heard the teachings of Abdul Baha out of Persia, who was preaching the teachings of his father, Baula, in what's known as the Baha'i faith, a religion that teaches the unity of all humanity. And he became to believe that this was the solution for the problems of racial strife. And Lewis Gregory is one of the earliest American figures responsible for the spread of the Baha'i faith. And there's a Lewis Gregory House in Charleston run by the Baha'i faith in order to commemorate that. So basically, this is the role that Charleston played as far as religion goes with its African American community. And some of the Africanisms and these practices that I discussed earlier can still be found today among many in the Sea Islands, whereas they were once a source of shame. People today come to understand that as a long-standing part of our history and culture. Thank you.
Thank you,
All right,
Professor
I'll take
Fordham.
questions.
What? Yeah. So we like to, I don't know, I started this tradition last week of kind of doing jazz hands for applause while we're all muted. So thanks for that fascinating, fast-paced, and rich tour of African-American faiths in Charleston. So I start, the audience is welcome to ask questions via the chat room. Something you want to know more about, something you didn't get to hear about, something you're not sure about. And we will, yeah, no, it's quiet out there, not just because it's muted. Whoops. So let me start off with a question, then I'll take the moderator's prerogative. And again, just keep, as you think of questions, keep them coming. I guess the question is, when I think of, the specific churches that you mentioned were mostly AME churches or Baptist churches. What about some of the other denominations? Anglican churches, Presbyterian churches, Churches of Christ. Do those also have African-American, separate African-American churches or African-American members in any of those denominations?
Not so much the Anglicans. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Not so much the Anglicans to my knowledge, but definitely the Church of Christ and all of those came along a bit more in more recent times, you see, compared to the others, because you see, Bishop Richard Harvey Kane went hard on converting the newly freed people into the AME faith following the end of slavery, you see, as well as the early days of the Baptist church. So the AMEs and the Baptists pretty much had a lock on the Black community up until, I would say, around the 1920s or so, when you began to see, when all this was going on, the Pentecostal faith didn't even exist as we know it today until the Azusa Street revival in 1906 in Los Angeles. So it took a while for the Pentecostal faiths to come to Charleston after that period. So that's more of a recent thing. Additionally, you had the Nation of Islam established a branch in Charleston around the 1960s, and then when its founder, Elijah Muhammad, died around 1975, most of them went into the Orthodox Islamic faith. And if you've been around in Charleston for a while, you might remember Wiley's Fish Supreme that was over on Spring Street, which was a main gathering place for a lot of people of the Muslim faith, and that introduced a lot of Charleston to the Islamic faith, as well as its masjid up on Hugo Avenue. And there was another one over on King Street, I might add too. So there was also, I should also add, the Zion Olivet Presbyterian Church was also a major Black church in Charleston. At one time, it was on Cannon Street, and today it is, in recent times, it has moved to North Charleston. And there was another Zion Presbyterian Church around 1865 that had the first convention of African Americans post-slavery in Charleston in 1865, where they made a manifesto in which they demanded their rights. So a lot of them do have their place in Charleston's history, but due to sheer numbers, the vast majority of them were Methodists and Baptists.
Great, thank you so much. So we've got some questions coming in and also some sort of additions or kind of additional data, which I'll read out. But let's turn to Linda Lucas. I'm going to unmute her right now. And so Linda, why don't you ask your question to Professor Fordham? You are unmuted. I can't see you here. I can ask the question for her if she's having her. It was a very short question. So, Linda's question was, where did the idea about quote unquote turning the Bible came from?
Excuse me?
Did you mention that in your talk, turning the Bible? No?
No.
All right.
Well, maybe,
Okay.
Reverend Jenkins, are you familiar with that term?
I am not. I have not. I'm not sure what that means.
Okay. Well, let's move on then. And actually, the next couple of questions came from you, Reverend Jenkins. So why don't you ask your questions?
Yeah, I wanted you, if you could say a little more about Reverend John Dart, who started the Charleston Industrial School. And then secondly, I'd like to hear a little more about Alexander Gatson, who taught others how to read the gospel.
Okay, what I know about Alexander Gatson comes from a little blurb in a book called Sketches of Negro Life in South Carolina by Professor Asa Gordon that was written in 1929. And unfortunately, he doesn't go into deep detail about that. However, somebody who is involved with perhaps with the famous Charleston History since 1945 website site on Facebook might have more information about him than I have, because basically all I found was that little blurb about him. But as for Reverend John Dart, he graduated with my great-great-grandfather, J.B. Maxwell, from the Avery Institute in 1873 or 1874. He was born free in Charleston. He was educated in Atlanta, Georgia, and went on to speak out. He went on to speak out on African American issues, as well as starting the Charleston Industrial School, which was at that time on Cracky Street. So after a period of time, the Colored Industrial School on Cracky Street would evolve into Burke High School in 1911, some 4 years prior to his death. And he was a close associate of people such as Booker T. Washington and other well-known African-American leaders who would come to Charleston during that time period. And he's basically one of the leaders who sort of kept things moving after African-Americans lost political power and the vote during Reconstruction. Reverend John Dart was among the main people who continued to speak out against whatever wrongs existed. He organized, as I mentioned before, helped to organize that anti-lynching meeting at Mother Emanuel, even though he was not the pastor of that church at that time. He was one of the main speakers at that event, and he published a pamphlet about the lynching of Frazier Baker that made the country aware of that. So he's definitely one of the great unsung heroes of Charleston's Black history.
All right.
Oh, wait, I have to add this. His daughter, Susan Dart Butler, established the John Dart Library out of the reading room that John Dart had, where he used to casually lend books to African Americans in the community. And his daughter, Susan Dart Butler, created the John Dart Library in 1927, 12 years after his death.
All right, thank you. This is just such a great wealth of information. Our next question actually comes from the scholar who gave last lecture, and that's Dr. Tony Pinn down in Texas. So I'm going to unmute him. And there's actually another question. Hold on, let me search for him, and I'll allow myself to unmute him. There he is. And so he's going to ask a question, and then actually, Nicola, you asked a kind of similar question. So I'm going to kind of pair them to get that. So Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much for that insightful lecture. I'm wondering if you could say a bit concerning the ways in which Black Christianity and African-based practices interacted in Charleston.
Oh, very simple. If you go into the less assimilated churches, where you had people who were not, say, of great formal education, who did menial labor and so forth. You had, okay, in the more prestigious churches, you had very staid English type hymns and so forth, and organ music and such, and very little in the way of the emotionalism that you associate with, that many people associate with African American religion. Whereas among people who were more low income, less formal education and menial jobs and so forth, you had a lot of Africanisms in the church, such as the clapping and the shouting and the spirit possession and so forth. And especially here in Charleston, you have what's called now called the Charleston clap. Whereas if you go, like say, when I go back to Spartanburg, the people in the churches clap like traditionally as you would have in the Black church. Here in Charleston, you have a double time rhythm that is very African and percussive, you see. And things like that were, and of course, I just mentioned the whole issue of spirit possession and so forth, or people catching the Holy Ghost, if you will, in Christian terms. When I was a boy in the late 60s and early 70s, in the upper class churches, all of that was frowned upon. They insisted on a very staged service. I remember hearing an older lady tell me, the lesser the education, the louder the noise in the church. And that was the attitude that people used to have in those days. But in recent times, when people are becoming more acceptive of themselves and their culture and so forth, you see this type of thing even happening now in churches where you did not see this before. When I was a boy, the idea of some of the more staid Baptist and AME churches having drums and all of that, and tambourines as you did in the holiness and Pentecostal churches, all of that was unheard of, but now it's very common, even in the quote unquote upper class churches.
Right. So, Ms. Daniels, did that answer your question, or do you want to sort of add on to that?
Yeah, I would like to just add, I mean, I really was blown away. Thank you so much for this presentation. I heard a lot about Kwanzaa, growing up, but I'm not sure if that is done in churches, or is it something, how did that, sort of tradition come to us? And is it something that the churches do? And do you know anything about the call and response? Because I've heard that in addition to the drumming, that call and response is something that maybe came from our ancestors, our African ancestors.
Kwanzaa is more of a recent celebration created in 1966 by Maulana Ron Karenga out of California, you see, and that was basically based around Black nationalism that you had in the 60s as a result of people having been disconnected from their culture and so on and so forth for a long period of time. Now, it's not considered generally a religious celebration. It's more of a cultural thing and an attempt for African Americans to learn more and getting back into their culture and so forth. Some churches celebrate it and some don't. It depends on the church, really, as far as that goes. Now, as for the call and response and such, if you look at videos of the griot performances in West Africa, and by that, I mean, when in many pre-literate societies in Africa, the source of history and information was the storytellers, who were often referred to as griots, who can memorize the stories of villages, kings, queens, people in a particular area and so forth. And that's often accompanied by musical performance where the griot interacts with the crowd. And you can trace a lot of the call and response between the Black preacher in many churches and his congregation to basically a somewhat of an Americanization of the performance of the griots of West Africa. And in many ways, they serve the same purpose, which is transmitting information to the people. Only the way they do it, it's a bit more interesting and basically more crowd involved than you would a standard lecture. Hope that helps.
Yeah. Great, we've got more. Keep the questions coming. We still have about 15 minutes or so. Our next question is from Frank Harris.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the presentation this evening, very enlightening. I was just wondering, with so much African-American church influence and of course, educated African-American clergy starting many of those churches, I was wondering why there was not the development or establishment of a historically Black college or university here in the local Charleston area, whereas in other communities where there was a strong church influence and educated community, there was that establishment in other places, even here in South Carolina, but always wondered why the jump was not made here in the local Charleston area.
Dr. John Hale, who until very recent times taught at the College of Charleston, did a paper on all this. And the plain truth of the matter was that the power structure of Charleston did not want a Black college here. It's just simple as that, because you see, many places in those days did not want Black colleges for the simple fact that one of the main purposes behind segregation and other things like that was to maintain a permanent class of cheap labor, you see. And so the best way to maintain a permanent class of cheap labor was to undereducate the people. And so oftentimes when you did have Black colleges in states like South Carolina, they were very rarely of the quality of, say, a Howard University or Morehouse College in Atlanta or something in a very much more cosmopolitan area like that. A lot of them, in fact, didn't have college courses as such as until well into the 1930s and 40s, you see. So that essentially answers that question, is the fact that depending on the area you were, it wasn't wanted. Now, in a place like Columbia, on the other hand, Columbia, up until very recent times, surpassed Charleston in population. And Columbia was one of those places where, unlike Charleston, see, Charleston was one of those places where people stayed here for generations since slavery, you see. And you got people here who could literally trace their ancestry to just throughout, the slavery era. Whereas Columbia, you had a mixture of people from different places bringing a whole lot of different ideas. The concept of old families in Columbia is just not a common one because everybody's from somewhere else. So with all these people bringing in these different ideas, it was somewhat easier to establish such things as Black colleges in a place like Columbia as opposed to Charleston, which is why you have Allen University and Benedict College up there, as opposed to a place like Charleston.
Interesting. I'm learning so much, as I'm sure most of you are as well. It's just like drinking from a fire hose of knowledge. So I'm next going to unmute Miss Cindy Wofford, who's had some great comments, and she just asked, I think, an important question.
Hi, the conversations for moving forward as a just society has certainly come into focus in 2020. How do you see Charleston and the history in Charleston leading the broader conversations in churches throughout our country?
In what way? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Everyone needs to hear your voice, and everyone needs to understand the history, and Charleston seems to be the epicenter for so much that happened.
That's true.
As the rest of the country understands, or at least begins to understand, how can we as a community lead that conversation and lead the process?
Oh, okay, I understand what you're saying now. Well, it's important to understand too that Charleston at one point was almost like a ground zero for the whole transatlantic slave trade to begin with, because it started here as early as 1670 with the arrival of Captain Nathaniel Sale bringing along John Jr. and Elizabeth. Of course, that's not their African names. That was the English names that were given to them. And this was where 40% of the transatlantic slave trade took place. So with all that said, it's important to understand in a place like Charleston, where you still have places like the Old Slave Market Museum, which is very important in understanding all of this. This is an important place to understand the whole dynamics of how a lot of the things that would affect the culture of Black people worked in the first place, because so many of these things, such as the gullah culture and all of that and the reaction to it, a lot of those things are still here for people to study. And fortunately now we have repositories of a lot of this information, like the Avery Research Center and a lot of these collections and oral histories at the College of Charleston and all of that, which preserved a lot of people such as the writings of DeMett's grandfather, the local civil rights leader Esau Jenkins, among many people such as that. Because in the past, voices, when you had great people like that who died, their stories went with them. So it's important that we get to understanding what these individuals had to say from the past, because see, that's helped us to understand how we got to this situation. And you could never find a cure if you don't know the cause.
Charleston seems to have the gift of that. And I think it's an important lesson for the entire country to learn. Thank you for your voice.
You're very welcome.
Yes, thank you. So I think we have time for maybe just one more question, but I'm getting a lot of really great questions that aren't quite on the topic of African-American religious diversity. They're more on sort of the history of African-American education in Charleston and so forth. And so maybe Professor Fordham, right now you could just say a word of how people can get in touch with you. Some people have asked if you are leading tours or something, which I think you do. So maybe you could give a little plug for other ways that people can be in contact with you if they want more of your deep knowledge.
Yes, I'm on Facebook, and I also have, my email address is Damon Fordham, DAMON FORDHAM 1964 @gmail.com. So with that, you can figure out my age also. I have a YouTube channel called The American Storyteller, which where I have videos of myself talking about things like this. I've written 3 books, as Reverend Jenkins mentioned earlier: True Stories of Black South Carolina and Voices of Black South Carolina, and a semi-autobiographical novel, Mr. Potts and Me. So as for my tour, it's called The Lost Stories of Black Charleston, which you could access through Buxton Books on 160 King Street. Number there is 843-723-1670. And you can call and set up a tour and such, where I go into a lot of these type of things. And plus, if you contact me via email, I'm very open to public speaking. And in fact, I haven't spoken out of state since I lectured at University of Berkeley back in 2013. So I'd love to get some speaking engagements out of state as well, aside from doing things on television and the like. So, feel free to contact me. I'd be more than happy to speak at your institutions, or, for any type of interview or something like that. I'm more than happy to be available for such things.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to invite Kayla Moore to ask just kind of a 3-part question. So get ready for this.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Hello, and thank you, Dr. Fordham, for taking your time tonight, and especially being able to talk about this informative seminar about Charleston. So my 3-part question I have to introduce is, like, when you speak on African American religion and culture, may you elaborate who was who biologically identifies as African American in the history of Charleston? Because it makes me just reflecting, it makes me think to how everybody wants to kind of go march hand in hand for unified communities and nations, yet structural racism and discrimination and oppression is not always being fully addressed, comprehended, and worked towards. So what role did racial and ethnic and also social groups play in valuing and molding power structures and social groups in Charleston? And what approaches are needed to learn and not repeat histories of discrimination and oppression?
Okay, as to who identifies as African American, historically in the United States, you had what's called the 1-drop rule, meaning that if you had even 1% of African descent, or Black blood, as they used to say, you were considered Black. which means that that people of African descent ranging from complexions such as mine up to, say, President Obama or Halle Berry or Alicia Keys would be considered Black or African American, if you will. I don't get too hung up on the technology and all that. And in South Carolina, the rule was 1/8, according to the 1895 Constitution that made segregation the law of the state to begin with. Now, with that being said, though, because of DNA and all of this, and the fact that it's now common knowledge that the foundation of the human race, when they found Lucy, the skeleton of Lucy back around the 70s and all that's been established, that humanity began in Africa to begin with. And the whole concept of race was a concoction of the Swedish scientist Carolus Linnaeus in about 1735, and dividing the 5 races of man and all that. That whole concept is artificial to begin with. So the whole issue of race is really more cultural now than anything else, you see. So basically, people who have any sort of Black ancestry are considered Black. Now, as for, and it's very important to study this history, because you see, part of the reason people got into this whole thing in the first place is because back during the 1600s, when you had the indentured servants and the enslaved Africans working side by side, the power structure feared them coming together to overthrow the wealthy power structure who oppressed them both. So they gave the poor whites artificial status over the enslaved Blacks. So as long as the two of them kept fighting each other, the rich people at the top, who was benefiting from the cheap labor of both, stayed fat and happy. And that's the foundation of racism in these United States. And if you don't understand that, as well as a lot of what has happened since that time, if you don't know what happened before you did this, I believe it was the Roman philosopher Cicero that once said it best: "He who does not know what happened before he was born shall forever remain a child." And of course, you will continue to make the same mistakes over and over if you don't study what's happened before. And we've seen a lot of that in recent times.
Right. Thank you so much. So we're just at almost exactly at 8 o'clock. So let me just make a couple of reminders. We'll prepare a video of this recording to send out to you all, and you can let other people look. And all of the information that Professor Fordham gave about his contact info, we can also put that in an email to you. So if you weren't writing fast enough, you can, we'll have it there. And we wish everybody a very safe and happy Thanksgiving. And we will see you, all of you, on December 8th, Tuesday at 7 p.m. for part 3 of this so far amazing speaker series. So what I think I'll do now, we didn't do this last time, but I'm going to unmute everyone just for 1 second. So you'll all be unmuted, so we can give an actual round of applause to Professor Fordham. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Fordham. Thank you for your knowledge and your wisdom.
Even the dogs are barking in applause.
That's right. Let it all rip now.
Yeah.
Hi, Elijah, I wanted to let Miss Nicola Daniels, you were asking about call and response. I sent you a message so that you could get some more information about that. So look in the chat.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Damon.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Damon.